What's up, folks? In this video, I'm going to be doing a redesign of the Cartoon Network logo. Now, to preface this, I'm a student who studies advertising and art. I am not a graphic design student, and I'm not a graphic designer. I do graphic design every once in a while, so I like to try to keep my skills semi-sharp, but by no means am I a professional or even really a graphic design student. So my goal for this video is to kind of see how my mind, as sort of somebody who is a little bit accustomed to graphic design, sort of goes through this redesign process. Hopefully just kind of go off my first impressions, my first instincts, and see how that turns out. It might be good, might be not so good, but we're gonna see. So here in front of me I have a mood board that I put together for this Cartoon Network logo redesign. So in the bottom left here you will see the 3 logos that Cartoon Network has had since it was founded in 1992. They've actually only had 3 logos. The first is this kind of double-decker Cartoon Network alternating black and white. The second is this, 2 squares, sort of a little bit of 3D type thing, and the third is this just really bland and boring 2 squares Cartoon Network. Something that I don't get about this logo is it's just black and white. I mean, cartoons are very colorful, and that's kind of their whole deal, right? So I'm not entirely sure why Cartoon Network decided to go with just a simple black and white logo. Obviously, I grew up with it. When I think about Cartoon Network, I can think about the logo right off the top of my head, so it works. But I think I'm going to try to give it a little bit more color, just a little bit more vibrance, and make it a little bit more interesting. So I thought about a couple of things when I was putting together this mood board. The first thought you'll see here is I kind of like this old-timey cartoon look, more of a vintage type thing, but I eventually decided that wasn't the way that I wanted to go. I think the way that I do want to go is sort of this 90s color palette, lots of blues and purples and brighter, more pastel colors. So I'm going to try to go with that. So we're going to hop over here into Illustrator. So I've got a blank Illustrator document here. I'm just going to pull in some of those images and start building a little bit of a color palette. So what I'm doing here is I'm just making rectangles, and I'm just using the eyedropper tool in Illustrator to just come and pick out some of these colors from these images. Now these are pretty simple color palettes. I know in this image especially there's a lot of gradients, a lot of blending between the colors, and I'm not really capturing that right now with my basic color palette, but once we get to our more final design, if we feel like it needs some gradients, we can kind of handle that then. Okay, so here I've pulled just 4 colors from each of these images, and now that I've got a basic color palette, I'm going to start working with the basic shapes, the basic design of the logo that I'd like to do. Now, I don't really want to change up the logo too much in terms of its basic structure. I like the way that they have sort of the 2 squares, the CN Cartoon Network. I think those work pretty well for the logo right now. I just don't really like how it's simple black and white, and I don't really like that current logo, how it is just 2 squares with the words under it. If we go back to the 2004 to 2010 logo, I like that one a little bit more. It feels a little bit more dynamic, and it also feels a little bit more lighthearted, which I think is the general tone of Cartoon Network. I mean, I'll admit I haven't watched it in quite a while, since I was a kid, but the way I remember it was much more lighthearted, a little bit more out there, and I feel like this 3D dynamic structure just fits that tone a little bit more. So I'm going to pull that in, I'm going to image trace it, and I'm going to start kind of messing around with it. Alright folks, so I done goofed. I realized I was not screen recording my computer. I had to restart Illustrator because of a couple of glitches, and after that I didn't pick back up the recording, so I'm just going to walk you through what I've done since then. Basically, the first thing that I did was I pulled the Cartoon Network logo that I liked into Illustrator. I image traced and expanded it so that it was a vector, and then I just went through and I added some of those colors from the color palette that we had created with the images from the mood board. So I just added some colors first without changing the structure of the logo at all, just to kind of see how that felt. So here's the result of that. I added in some of those brighter colors, and already I feel like it looks better. It's more interesting. It feels more like what the logo of a cartoon channel should be. It's brighter, and it's just overall more engaging, I think. And then I decided that I wanted to sort of give this logo sort of a glitchy old TV feel, and that's kind of what I'm in the middle of doing right now. So I'll show you where I'm at on that. So the first thing I did was I added a solid color background to it. I used this purple, and I'll show you kind of how I did this. So I've got a few layers here on Illustrator, right? The first layer is just a purple background, and the top layer is that logo that we just had. I did change that purple background that's in here to a yellow just so that it would show up against this all purple background here. And then what I did underneath was I took those shapes, I copied them, and then I just moved them over a little bit and lowered the opacity. So they kind of look like that. There's one, there's another. Together they look like that, and behind the whole thing, they kind of give this sort of stacked little bit of 3D vibe to it. Now, I'm not totally finished with this quite yet. I think I'm going to go in here and I'm going to adjust some of these edges so that they're not all just copied and pasted. They're a little bit more out there, a little bit more varied. In the original logo, these are definitely not, you know, like artistically correct 3D boxes. They do get a little bit more creative with it, and they kind of go outside the lines, outside the rules a little bit. So I'm going to do that as well with mine, and I'm going to do that right now. Okay, so I went in there, I kind of started changing things around a little bit, and it wasn't really working out. And honestly, I'm pretty satisfied with what we have here already. I'm thinking I might try a little bit of that same effect with the text, so let's see how that turns out. Alright, so now I've got this sort of 3D effect on the text, and I actually really like how it turned out. I did switch some of the colors around a little bit because the blue version of the text that I kind of dragged down and turned the opacity down on, that blue wasn't matching the blue that was behind the N, or the bluish green, and that was kind of bugging me. So I switched the blue behind the N to a more tame blue from our color palette, and then I slipped that blue-green in there in a couple more places, kind of in that stack of shapes behind the Cartoon Network. So I'm actually really satisfied with this as the base design. Now I do want to give this more of a 90s feel, more of a vintage feel, and I think the way that I want to do that is through adding texture over the top of it, and I think I want that texture to be kind of like a VHS, sort of old TV type texture, sort of in the way that if you look at this image here, this image has a nice texture to it that makes it seem printed. I want this logo to make it seem like you're watching it on an old 90s TV on a VHS maybe. So I'm gonna actually export this from Illustrator, I'm gonna bring it into Photoshop, and I'm gonna start working on some texture. Okay, so I've brought my logo into Photoshop here, and I found a VHS overlay that I've laid over the top of it, and so when I turn that on, it looks like this, and I really like this. I think it gives it a really nice texture. The play up in the corner is very reminiscent of a VHS. I'm not entirely convinced that it should stay, however, I do like the texture.
Texture.
No!
Texture.
God!
Texture. Texture.
No! God,
Texture.
please, no!
Texture.
No! No! No!
What I've done with this image is it was originally a black image. If I show you the normal here, that's what it looked like. But I went down to the, I just kind of scrolled through these blend modes to see which one looked right. Originally was looking at the screen, but I decided eventually on the exclusion. I feel like it just looks the best. So I might toy around with a couple other overlays, but for right now I'm really liking this. Alright, so I've settled on this. I used a different VHS overlay, one that didn't have the play on it, and I'll walk through my layers here just to show you what I've done. So this was our original logo. I dropped this VHS overlay on it. I used the screen blend mode so that the black went away and you could see the image through, and then I dropped the opacity to 62%. No reason for 62, I just dropped it until it looked right. And then I thought that the image looked a little bit too dull after we've added that overlay to it, so I added a brightness contrast adjustment layer over the top in Photoshop, and I just brightened that up, and I also added a bit of contrast because as it brightened, it did look like it started to lose a little bit of its contrast there, and actually looking at it now, I might bump it up just a little bit more just like that. And then after that, I added a hue and saturation layer, and I just brought back some of that saturation. So our colors did shift quite a bit from this to this, but I don't mind it. I think it looks a little bit more faded, a little bit more vintage, something that you might see on an old, cartoon channel when you're watching on a VHS. I mean, obviously you wouldn't really watch live cartoons on a VHS, but I think it works pretty well. So I'm gonna take this is gonna be our final product for the TV mock-up that we're gonna do, but I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna run back to Illustrator. I'm gonna do a couple different things with this so that we could throw it on some merch or things like that, something that's a little bit more versatile than just a rectangle. Alright, so there you have it, folks. Here's our final redesigned logo for Cartoon Network. On top you have a simpler logo, one that can be used on merch and such, something that doesn't have a texture on it. And on the bottom we have our textured logo that will be displayed on the TV channel as a bumper between, commercials and shows and such. Over here we have our simpler version of that TV bumper. That's also something that's good to have, but this is our final textured version. So I'm gonna go mock those up and I'll show those at the end of this video. If you like the design, if you don't like the design, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Throw a brick through my window, please, if you hate it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.